Hello everyone. Today we're gathered here to discuss about the union budget that was tabled earlier this week. I'm Divya Srinivasan. I'm a research associate at the Center for Social and Economic Progress. I'm joined here with my colleague Aashi Gupta and Dr. Janak, who's a senior fellow at CSEP. Prior to CSEP, he had an illustrious career as a central banker with the Reserve Bank of India. He was also a member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the RBI. And I hope this is a very fruitful discussion.
Yeah. Thank you, Divya. Yeah.
So to start with, how would you describe the budget?
Yeah, Divya, if I have to describe this budget, I would say it's a fiscally prudent and forward-looking budget.
So we saw a lot of announcements made by the finance minister in the budget this time. What are your high-level takeaways from it, and what are your macro perspective? We saw that the nominal GDP growth is pegged at 10.5%, which is similar to what was there last year.
Yeah, four key takeaways for me. The budget was number one, fiscal consolidation. The finance minister has continued on the path of fiscal consolidation. Number two, quality of expenditure has continued to improve. Number three, they are basically moving in the direction of simplification of the regulations.
Dr. Raj, you mentioned about fiscal consolidation. So, what is your take on the efforts made by the government till now and the way forward?
Yeah, you see, fiscal consolidation was the most important which the government has done, and it was very much required. Let me give you some background of this fiscal consolidation. Why was it required? If you see the period from 2003 onwards, when the FRBM Act was passed, under the FRBM Act, the government was required to achieve the fiscal deficit target of 3% of GDP. And when the Act was introduced, fortunately we had very good growth period. And during the period between 2003 to 2008, the government was able to achieve good fiscal consolidation. It reduced the gross fiscal deficit from I think 5.8% of GDP in 2003-04 to 2.5% by 2007-08. After that target was achieved, we had a big global financial crisis, and the gross fiscal deficit shot up to over 6%.
Yes.
So after about a year or so, again the fiscal consolidation process started. In this period also we tried to reduce the gross fiscal deficit. There were change in the government in the meantime, but the fiscal consolidation process continued. And by 2018-19, if I remember correctly, the gross fiscal deficit was reduced to 3.5% of GDP. But then we faced the COVID-19 pandemic, and the gross fiscal deficit shot up to 9.2%. So that pushed up our debt to GDP ratio to close to 60%. Oh, I'm talking about the central government debt to GDP ratio close to 60%. Now under the FRBM Act, when we started the FRBM Act, we started with the gross fiscal deficit as the target, but then 2018, the Act was amended, and the government was mandated to achieve the debt to GDP ratio 40%, and the gross fiscal deficit was made as an operational target 3%. Of course, India was not the only country which had high debt to GDP ratio following the COVID pandemic. There were many other countries. But this was a matter of serious concern. So the government again started fiscal consolidation efforts, and our debt to GDP ratio is still not getting reduced, but it is getting stabilized because the government is pursuing fiscal consolidation. Yeah.
So we see that the government has budgeted the primary deficit to be at minus 1.4% of GDP, which is a huge reduction this year. So do you think this has some implications for the debt to GDP ratio in the coming years?
See, Aashi, this debt to GDP ratio is a function of two things. One is interest rate and growth differential.
Okay.
So you can take interest rate on 10-year government security, and you can take nominal GDP growth. So we have favorable differential, which is around 3.5, 3.7%, which can help us to stabilize debt to GDP ratio. In order to reduce the debt to GDP ratio, we need to also reduce primary deficit. This 1.6% primary deficit, debt to GDP ratio may not rise. It could stabilize, but it will. I don't think with this we can reduce debt to GDP ratio. We need to make efforts to reduce debt to GDP ratio. The number which we crunched in the morning, it shows that debt to GDP ratio changes from 57% something at present level to just it comes to 55% or so by end of 2030. So that means if we take the primary balance at the level at which it is, then debt to GDP ratio is not improving much.
Right. But when we look at the fiscal deficit, the finance minister has mentioned that by the end of the fiscal year, we are targeting 4.9% of the GDP. So, in a sense, India's fiscal health, given that there was COVID, right now is doing pretty well. We see even advanced economies like US, which had to amend its debt ceiling. But then one issue with the reduction in fiscal deficit this time is that it's been at the back of the massive RBI surplus that the government has received. And the government has received about 2.1 trillion rupees from the RBI. And this is not sustainable. We've seen in the past the surplus changes with the years. So it's not a sustained amount of money that the government is going to get. Given that backdrop, how do you see the government's efforts in terms of fiscal consolidation? Would you have rather preferred they would have used the money to fuel in growth?
Okay, so I will come to your second question later. So let me first explain a bit about the transfer of surplus from the Reserve Bank to government and what the government has done. The government in the interim budget had budgeted something like 80 to 90,000 of transfer from the Reserve Bank of India. But actually the amount was much larger at 2.1 trillion, which rupees 2.1 trillion which you mentioned. So this was a windfall gain for the government. So half of the money which came from the Reserve Bank, which they had not budgeted, has been utilized to pursue fiscal consolidation. If you see the number, the fiscal deficit target in the interim budget was 5.1%. Now it is 4.9%. So I think it was very prudent thing to do. And otherwise, if they had used all the surplus for increasing expenditure, then deficit would have stayed 5.1%. And as I mentioned earlier, it is very important for us to reduce the primary deficit to achieve a sustainable debt to GDP ratio, which is at a very elevated level. So again, this answers your second question, like whether the government should have spent. I would say no, it would have been better, and that's what the government has done to pursue fiscal consolidation. Half the money they are used for fiscal consolidation, which is good, and half they are used for other expenditure. Yeah.
Dr. Raj, that were very interesting insights from the revenue side of the budget. Coming to the expenditure side, you mentioned something about the quality of expenditure. So, recent years, in the recent years, we have seen the sustained focus of the union government on capital expenditure. What is your take on that?
See, when we talk about fiscal consolidation, consolidation is contractionary because the government is basically not spending as much as should be. But in order to counter that the impact of fiscal consolidation on the economy, the government has been improving quality of expenditure. If you see the data, the government has increased the capital expenditure and it has reduced the revenue expenditure. And this is absolutely was required, which the government has done. And the fiscal multiplier in the case of capital expenditure is very high. Like in the case of revenue expenditure, some study was done in the Reserve Bank of India in April 2019. It was found even less than 1. But in the case of capital expenditure, it was found 3.25. So that means for every 1 rupee which the central government spends as capital expenditure, it leads to an increase of 3.25 rupees increase in the output. So it was again a very prudent decision, although the government was pursuing fiscal consolidation. But at the same time, government changed the quality of expenditure, and that helped the government to mitigate the adverse impact of fiscal consolidation of the economy.
So that was a very interesting point on the government's focus on capex. With this government specifically, we've seen over the last few years there is a consistent focus on the capex. But on the other hand, despite the increase in spending, they've doubled their capex spending from 1.7% of the GDP in 2020 to about 3.4, in the recent years. But despite that, we have not seen private investments picking up. In the earlier years in 2000s, we saw that whenever government capex grew, it was followed by a growth in private capex, because government essentially lays the foundation for infrastructure for the private sector to grow further. So why do you think this time the private sector has not yet, increased their capex or increased their investment intentions despite government's push?
Yeah, Divya, it's a very interesting question, and it's some sort of puzzle as to why it has not happened. Not only that, in September 2019, the government had cut the corporate taxes in order to spur capital expenditure.
Right.
But so far that capex by the corporate sector has not picked up. There are a couple of reasons. Number one, there have been some uncertainties, like this tax cut was done in September 2019, as I mentioned, but immediately after the COVID followed. The impact of COVID remained about a year and a half.
Right.
And after that, Ukraine-Russia war started. So I think, and then that war is almost 1.5 years old, and then election was expected. So I think there have been some uncertainties, because of which I think corporate has not taken capex. But I believe that now that war, of course, nobody can say when it will get over. But insofar as our elections are there, outcome is there now, and the same government has come back, and that suggests policy continuity. So I believe in this now there should be pick up in private capex. And one more thing which I can add here is the interest rate cycle, globally as well as domestically, it appears it has peaked now.
Yes.
And going forward, we can expect some rate reduction from the RBI, so that should further help the corporate to take investment initiative.
Right, that's interesting to know. So you believe that the private sector from here on,
Yeah, I believe that capex should pick up from maybe in the next few months.
that's a good
yeah.
news for
Yeah.
India's GDP growth. You want to go ahead?
Coming to so overall, talking about the budget, what are the areas they missed according to you?
Three areas which I feel budget should have done much better, where the budget has not done, I would say. One is the spending on health. So spending on health has not improved. If you see the record of last 30 years, public health spending has stayed at about 1% of GDP,
Okay.
of which almost 2/3 is done by the state governments and 1/3 is by the central government. Even in this year budget, that health spending is just 0.27% of GDP as compared with the 0.26% of GDP last year. So it has not improved. This health spending is much lower. I am talking about public health spending in India than it is there in other countries. As a result of which, out-of-pocket expenditure in India is very high. So, and many people have been pushed below the poverty line because of this high out-of-pocket expenditure. So I would feel this is one area where the government would have paid more attention. Second area, if we have, so far whatever fiscal consolidation has happened, if I recollect correctly, a reduction in gross fiscal deficit of 2.9% of GDP has come from expenditures and the remaining from the revenue side. So the focus of the government in the case of fiscal consolidation, of course, expenditure had increased when the government gave the fiscal stimulus. So the focus has been on cutting down on expenditure. By compressing expenditure, government has reduced fiscal deficit. But there are limits to fiscal consolidation through through expenditure compression. So I would feel that the time has come when we need to push up the tax to GDP ratio. Tax to GDP ratio has remained almost stagnant in the last 10 years. There is no improvement in the tax to GDP ratio. And if you see the data, corporate sector contribution to total direct taxes which the government collects, it has come down. I can give you some numbers. See, in 2014-15, the corporate sector share was in total direct taxes which the government collected was 61.8%. And now it has come down to 2023-24, it has come down to 46.6%. So instead of rising, the share of corporate taxes in the total direct tax collected by the government, it has come down. I think this is a matter of concern, and I don't know really where lies the problem, but unless we improve the tax to GDP ratio, it will be very challenging to pursue more fiscal consolidation. Yeah.
So you made a very good point on the tax to GDP ratio. I think there's a constant debate on how in India we should increase the tax to GDP ratio. The finance minister also mentioned this time that they will, going ahead, take up some changes on the income tax regime and probably make it better. So what is your opinion on that? They've also increased the standard deductions this time. How do you see these changes impacting direct tax collections?
Yeah, these changes are, in a way, they are welcome because there have not been much changes in the case of direct taxes for the middle class in the last several years. The government has not given any benefit under the old tax regime, but under the new tax regime, the government has given higher standard deduction, 75,000 from the earlier 50,000 rupees.
Right.
And they have also tweaked some tax slabs. I think it's a good, and the government has also tried, as I mentioned earlier, tried to simplify the taxation. Like there is almost no uniform capital gain on all asset classes, which is a good thing. The government is also going to review the Income Tax Code 1961, which is again a good thing. I'm sure they will simplify it. And the government has also reduced customs duty on some of the, I would say of all the areas where the government has reduced customs duty, 25 critical minerals,
Right.
they were very important. So these concessions which the government has given, there will be some revenue foregone. If the number which came from government officials after the budget was presented, I think the government will be foregoing revenue something like 37,000 crore.
Yes.
But the government would also be getting additional tax revenue, something like 30,000 crore. In the net, if you see, the government will be losing 7,000 crore or so in the case of revenue.
Right. And because we're on the topic of revenue, and you mentioned that fiscal consolidation can be done by the contractionary expenditure, which will lead to a contractionary effect on the GDP or increase in the revenue. We heard about tax to GDP. Another area which the government earlier focused was on the disinvestments. There were very high disinvestment targets in previous few years, but almost in all years except one, we never met the targets. And last year the government had budgeted 51,000 crore, but we never made it to that, and this year it's also constant at 50,000 crore. So do you think it's time for the government to focus on asset monetization to boost its revenue?
No, this is another area of disappointment if you ask me, because if you see the data on disinvestment, the target which the government has fixed from time to time, there were only 3 years, I think, of last several years. I'm not talking about this particular regime, I'm talking even in the earlier.
Right.
So we have achieved the target only 3 years. So even despite the fact that we have very buoyant secondary market, so this year also the target which has been fixed 50,000 crore is more or less the same with what was fixed last year, but that last year target itself was not met. It was revised downwards, but even that was not met. And government has of course been doing also monetization of assets, and it has mobilized some revenue, but the need for such revenue is much more than what the government has done so far. And as you said that it's time to focus on disinvestment and monetization of assets, because if you have to reduce fiscal deficit and if you don't want to compress expenditure more, then the only way you can do is to basically raise revenue either by improving the tax administration or by doing more disinvestments, including even strategic sale of assets. Yeah.
A key area everybody was looking forward to was government addressing the unemployment situation in the country. And we see that the government has introduced a lot of welfare schemes, employment schemes in the budget this year that majorly focus on skill development. So do you have any opinion on that?
You know, the government has introduced 3 schemes which are welcome, because given the of course unemployment numbers, you know, they are different from different sources. I don't want to get into that, but it's very important to generate employment, especially for the youth, and the government has done a good thing by introducing 3 schemes. Of the 3 schemes which the government has introduced, I think the scheme which is related to internship, I think it's very important. When you hear the industry, they say that there is a huge gap between the skill set, what they are looking for and what they are getting. So I think this internship should make the youth employable. And I was watching some program yesterday, and they said they wanted to have welders. So for 3 months they couldn't get the welders, and they had to basically then train them in their factory. So if such shortage is there, so they were looking for people, but they were not getting people. So this only says there was skill set gap. So I believe this will help in bridging that skill set gap, and that should help youth to get more employment. Yeah.
So it was very interesting hearing from you about all your takes on the budget. So in conclusion, it seems like the budget is fiscally prudent. They've taken care of the fiscal deficit and brought it, and are expecting to bring it down to 4.9. They've also ensured that the economy doesn't face the brunt of it. So they've ensured that there is a strong focus on capex, as has been the case in the past few years with this government. And alongside, to take care of the demographic dividend that India currently has, they've also ensured to take steps on the employment issues. So I think it's a very balanced budget that has come out, and that's the sense I get from you.
No, absolutely. The budget, other than 1 or 2, 3 negative things which we found, like in the area of health, disinvestment and tax to GDP ratio, I think this budget ticks most of the boxes. And I take heart from this fact that the government has pursued fiscal consolidation relentlessly in the last several years, and that's very important, because even though the government makes its efforts to reduce the debt to GDP ratio, it will take quite a number of years before we reach the sustainable level. So I think on the whole the budget was, as I mentioned at the beginning, was fiscally prudent budget. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much. We learned a lot from you, and hopefully the viewers of this video will also.
Okay.
It was really great having you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Divya. Thank you, Aashi. Thank you.